So it's a pleasure to have everybody here. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Matteo Pazzona, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance here at Brunel. Again, thanks everybody for joining this online meeting, this talk. So the reason for this meeting, of course, is the launch of the report UK Immigration After Brexit that is being written on behalf of the Center of Law, Economics and Finance here at Brunel, directed by Nigar, who is also online. So thanks, Nigar, for allowing us to do this research. So why to write a report on immigration? We all know that immigration was a key issue in the debate for the Brexit referendum now 7 years ago, but also is very topical. There is this recent interview by Rishi Sunak, where he pledged to control net migration. Then we will talk more about this later on. But of course, so since the Brexit referendum until now, migration has been like at the center of the spotlight of the public debate. So that's why we want to know a bit more about that. So this report has been written with Federico Filauri, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Advanced Studies, University of London. He's doing philosophy. And also Emrego Kelly, who is a former PhD student at Brunel. Now he's a lecturer in Turkey. So let me just briefly give you kind of the schedule for this presentation, for this talk. So Federico will present the results of the report for 15 minutes. It will follow a kind of a long discussion with Marina Fernandes-Reino, who is I'm going to introduce her later on, but she's a senior researcher at the Migration Observatory in the Center of Migration Policy and Society, Compass, at the University of Oxford. Thanks for joining us. And we will have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. Ideally, I would prefer people to just unmute themselves and switch on their camera and ask the question directly. Marina is fine with that, so that would be kind of more informal way to discuss. So ideally, it's going to be kind of a discussion at the end without us having to read a question from the chat box. So let me hand it over to Federico. Again, thanks, Federico. It's been nice to have you as a co-author in this report.
Many thanks, Matteo, for the opportunity to join you on this research, and of course to present here with you. Thanks also to Marina for having accepted our invitation. Let me briefly share my screen. I have a couple of slides to show you. So as Matteo said, our study is about the immigration flux in the UK after Brexit. So let us just recall that the Brexit referendum took place on the 23rd of June 2016. And then after several years of negotiations and a transitional period, the UK left the European Union on the 31st December 2020. On the 1st January 2021, the British government also adopted a new immigration policy, which will be one of the main subjects of this discussion. Now, a brief note on the data we used. All the data that we gathered is publicly available, and we mainly collected the data from the Office for National Statistics, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Home Office, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and a bit also from the Reading Survey on higher education. Now, very quickly, what are the main or the most significant points of this new migration policy that enter into effect on the 1st January 2021? The first one is that the policy applies to EU and non-EU citizens alike. So it makes no distinction between Europeans and non-Europeans when it comes to immigrating into the UK. And this basically means the end of the free movement for European citizens that was in place when the UK was still part of the European Union. The new system is formally a points-based system, meaning that to be granted leave to remain or leave to work in the UK, one has to totalize a certain amount of points based on skills like language skills, work skills, and other factors. But there are very strict criteria for visa eligibility, and there is no flexibility as to how to gain most of the points, which basically it means that especially for work visas, the new policies is de facto an employer-driven work permit system rather than a fully fledged points-based immigration system. So besides the visitor visa, we find also work visas and student visas, and the new policy also included new visa types. So the main visa types that have been introduced are the skilled worker visa and the graduate scheme for people coming to study into the UK. This latter is the graduate scheme or graduate route allows students to live and work in any job in the UK for 2 years after their graduation, and the skilled worker visa is aimed at workers who got middle or high skilled jobs. We're going to talk about these two things a bit more in detail later on. So let's move on with the general picture of what is the net migration into the UK, covering a period, as the graph shows, from 2002 to last year, 2022. So we have like a picture of the trends of the net migration in the last 2 decades. Because the new policy, of course, had a repercussion on migration patterns. Now, when we talk about net migration, we talk about the total number of people moving in minus total number of people moving out. So immigration minus emigration. This is what is displayed here in this graph. When we look at the last bit of our graph, the last few years, so from June 2020 to June 2022, this is the last data available for us as of now. We see that there are rather remarkable trends for the non-European net migration, which registered a total of 509,000 net migrants, whereas the European migration had a minus 51,000. In total, we have a new record of 458,000 more people in the UK in 2002. Now, this graph takes into account the 133,000 Ukrainian citizens who moved into the UK thanks to the so-called bespoke humanitarian route. But we chose to not display the data for British national overseas, from especially those coming from Hong Kong, which amounted to 75,000 people. Anyways, it must be noted that even if we take into account Ukrainians and British national overseas from Hong Kong, these amount to only 30% of the total extra-European immigration, which amounts to 704,000. Now, this graph, after these two provisos, this graph clearly shows that after the Brexit referendum in 2016, there has been a constant decrease in EU net migration, and one can clearly follow the blue line here. Ultimately, ended up in a negative net migration. So there's more Europeans moving out of the UK than moving in. On the other hand, we see that, especially after the pandemic, the figures of non-European migration skyrocketed and registered in the last year a plus 224%, more than 3 times higher than before. This new trend is mainly led by international students, 277,000, and skilled workers, 151,000, mainly from non-European countries. These are the main kind of migrants that are coming into the UK in 2022. I've said that this is the latest available data, but next Thursday, the government, the Office for National Statistics, will release the new data covering this new quarter. So probably for when our paper will be ready, we'll include the new data as well. It is useful to then narrow it down. This is the broad picture, and we have to narrow it down, focusing on student migration, workers migration, and then I will add a note at the end on irregular migrants. Now, when it comes to the students, I've said before that one of the main points of the new policy is the introduction of the graduate route, which allows the students who come to study in the UK, it grants the possibility to live and work in the UK for 2 years after their graduation, or for 3 years in the case of PhD students, and to work in any kind of job at any skill level and any salary. This has reopened. A very similar scheme was already in place, and then it's been suspended before. This might explain, at least in part, the general increase in the total number of new enrollments. So this graph here shows the enrollments of new students, so people enroll into the first year in UK universities. First year, both undergraduate and postgraduate. We register over the past 5 years a noticeable increase from 254,000 to 382,000 students. But of course, it's noticeable that European and non-European students have different trends in this. I mentioned before there is a notable increase over the last year in non-European students. This light blue line here, there's a plus 32% in 2022, and they come mainly from 3 nationalities, which are India, China, and Nigeria. Now, on the other hand, we have the European students, and we registered a fall. There's a fall of students enrollment number from EU nationals, and there's a minus 53% in the last year. Now, this can be related to the higher tuition fees that EU students have to pay now, because now the fee rate, the tuition fee rate for EU and non-EU students is the same, which meant for European students almost a doubling of the total tuition fee they have to pay. And this is one of the main deterrent factors for Europeans coming to study into the UK. And another possible deterrent factor explaining this fall in EU students' numbers is the need to apply for a student visa and then the graduate route afterwards, which then ends up in the need for one of the main working visas. So there's less certainty about their possibility to remain in the UK after the end of this 2-year period. And this could be another deterrent factors. Now, last tiny note on how many people remain in the UK on the long run after having studied in the country. among non-European migrants issued an initial study visa in 2016, only 17% still had permission to stay in the UK, so a valid leave to remain in 2021. So 5% have held work visas in 2021, 9% were still on study visas, and 0.1% had a settlement status, which means that 83% of the students from non-European countries coming to study in 2016 must have left the country. So in a way, it's a long-term but temporary migration. And I think we're going to discuss a bit this issue later on. It is interesting, however, to compare the trends of Irish students to students from other EU nationalities. So this graph shows a comparison between Irish students here and other European countries. The left column in purple indicates the average of new enrollments between 2017 and 2020, whereas the right column, the one here in indigo, is the enrollment in 2021, 2022. Now, it is interesting to compare these two because Irish students are an exception because they are subject to the same tuition fee rates payable by UK nationals. So they have home status. The other EU citizens have overseas tuition fee status, which in average, they are 84 to 97% higher, so almost double the price, as I said before. So if you consider this period from 2017 to 2021, the constant trend of new Irish students enrollment is strikingly different from the sharp fall that we see here of enrollments from all other EU nationalities, cut by more than half. We've seen in total 53% less. So one can speculate that the trend of Irish students, so the number being virtually constant, if not even slightly increasing in this 4-year period, this trend would have applied to all EU students as well, was it not for post-Brexit referendum conditions. Okay, enough about the students. Another big category of visas were issued to workers. I've briefly mentioned before that the new migration policy entails mainly 3 kinds of worker visa types. There are high-value work visas for investors, entrepreneurs, or exceptional people with exceptional talents. There are sponsored long-term work visas. The main subtype here is the skilled worker visa, the focus of this section. And then there are short-term worker visas for like seasonal workers. If we focus on this subtype of the skilled worker visa, the requirements of the skilled worker visa are the following. The first is that the worker has to be in receipt of a work offer for middle or high-skilled jobs, and there is a list provided by the government. The second is that they must earn an annual salary of at least £26,200 annually, or £10.75 hourly, or they have to earn at least a salary that is at least at a job's going rate, which is the typical rate for salaries in that kind of occupation. Now, what does it mean for Europeans and non-Europeans? If we look at non-Europeans, this means basically a liberalization of the job market, because previously, since the 2010s onwards, Tory-led governments, in order to meet the net migration target, so to lower the net migration, introduced a policy that set a salary threshold for non-Europeans of 30,000 to be able to work, and 35,000 yearly for gaining settlement after 5 years, which was, of course, a huge impediment, a huge obstacle to be overcome. So with the new migration policy in 2021, these restrictions on non-EU citizens were eased, and the salary threshold was lowered to 26,000. And the tier 2 visa cap was scrapped. There was also a visa cap. The total amount of non-European workers was kept for each year. On the other hand, the new policy meant a restriction for European citizens that now have to apply for a visa. And of course, not everyone would be able to get the same, especially people working in non-skilled jobs. Now, to capture this, we chose to look at the registrations for the national insurance number over the course of the last 20 years, which is what this graph shows. So people who want to work in the UK have to register for a national insurance number before or shortly after they start to work. So we use this as a proxy for migrants or worker migrants coming to the UK. The steady but low increase in European national insurance number registrations from 2009 to 2014, if we look at the purple line here, can be explained or can be related to the debt crisis that took place in the European Union from 2009 to the mid to late 2010, and several Eurozone state member states' economies were impacted, resulting in job losses. And as a consequence, many Europeans sought to start a career abroad, and the UK was one of the main destinations. In addition to that, over the year 2000s, several new countries became European Union member states. These are the EU8 and EU2, especially countries from the Balkans and from Eastern Europe. Now, there is a period of 5 to 7 years of transitional controls that have been eased in 2011 and in 2014. Now, these transitional controls being eased, the results can be seen here in this increase of the number of national insurance number registrations, especially here after EU2 border controls have been eased in 2014. And this is the registered peak in registrations. However, it must be noted that already after the referendum, the Brexit referendum took place in 2016, there is a steady decrease in registrations. From here, 2016, there is this decrease. Now, if we look at the other line, if we look at the indigo line for non-Europeans, we see that there is a slight but constant increase until 2011, when a new policy was enforced, the one I was talking about before, which set a stringent visa cap and a higher salary threshold. And this explains this plunge in the national insurance number applications. In both cases, both lines, we see this plunge here corresponding to the COVID pandemic, because at the pandemic outbreak, the processes for national insurance number registrations was slowed. And lastly, we can notice the new peak in extra-Europeans worker migration here, which is correspondent to this liberalization of the job market and the liberalization of the entrance in the UK for non-Europeans. On the other hand, we see that the European new registrations for national insurance number is more or less constant and is very far from the peak that reached in 14 and 15. Now, the new policy determined not only changes between the trends in European and extra-Europeans, but also among European states. This graph here shows the number of work visas granted to European citizens from 2021, from the first quarter of 2021 to the third quarter of 2022, according to the country group. And what is noticeable is that EU 14 member states, like Western Europe, broadly understood, they take most of the skilled worker visas, whereas the EU 2 and EU 8 member states still mark a slight increase, but in many cases it's almost constant. And EU 2 and EU 8, as I was saying before, is broadly understood like Eastern Europe and the Balkan states. This can partly, at least, reflect the nature of work migration coming from different European country groups. So it is likely that workers from EU 2 and EU 8 countries used to work in low-skilled jobs before the enactment of the new policy, and then therefore they are now cut off by the new system that privileges highly skilled jobs. Okay, enough said for the workers. And lastly, a note on irregular immigration, which is also something worth looking at. So on the 28th of April 2022, the Parliament approved the government-sponsored Nationality and Borders Act. It entered into effect in June the same year. The main points of this policy, which is a stricter policy, is that it included a differential treatment of refugees, distinguishing between those arriving from a life-threatening country or territory and all the others, so-called economic migrants. The policy increased the standard of proof for finding a persecution. So it made more difficult to prove one is persecuted. Lastly, it penalized applicants for late evidence submissions for an asylum, submission claims for an asylum or human rights. So the expectation was that a stricter policy would act as a deterrent for those wishing to reach the UK illegally. Now, if we look at the numbers displayed in the graph here, this graph shows the total number of asylum applications and asylum grants or other forms of protection over the past 12 years, divided by quarter. And looking at the last 2 years here, one can see that there is a sharp increase in the number of asylum applications. And this is reflected in the fact that number of people crossing the channel on small boats in 2022 exceeded 45,700. And this marked a 60% increase from 2021. And last year also marked a new peak, a 30 years peak in the number of asylum seekers with 86,000 applicants. This is the reason why also on the 8th March 2023, so less than 2 months ago, the government proposed a new illegal migration bill in a further attempt to prevent people from illegally making their entrance in their country. And the bill is currently under discussion. But in sum, the Nationality and Borders Act 2022 has not caused irregular migration to stop. And with this note, I think I have ended a summary of the results that we gathered, and I'll hand it over to Matteo to continue our discussion.
Okay, Federico, thank you very much for your presentation. Just a note, we are finalizing the report, which will be published on the university webpage. We still have to, to define the details, so this will be available if you're interested in reading it. So now let me involve Marina. First of all, let me remind you who Marina is. She's a senior researcher at the Migration Observatory at Oxford. She has a PhD from Pompeu Fabra. And it's a pleasure to have you here to discuss the report and in general immigration to the UK. So I have a question to you. So in general, I would like to have your opinion about the report, but to have a more punctual question is, of course, as Federico said before, this week, on Thursday, the government, the ONS is going to release the data on the net migration, and everybody is expecting a high number, right? People estimate range between 600 and 1 million. So of course we don't know the number, but for sure there's going to be a higher number than the 500 than we had in 2022. So the question to you is really if you have any sense about the number we could expect, and also considering what Rishi Sunak said recently in his interview, like pledging some kind of measure to limit, to cap this number. So what do you think the government could do? What are the policies that the government could propose and implement to limit this number?
Yeah, thanks first of all for having me here. Thanks for producing this report. So regarding there's a lot of discussion about the next net migration figures that will be released on Thursday, and they will certainly be. I mean, obviously it's difficult to speculate, but the expectation is that they will be higher than the last ones, which were at 500,000. I mean, this is a combination of different factors, as I think you mentioned during the presentation. Some of them are totally unrelated to Brexit immigration policy, mostly the issue of Ukraine, so people arriving from Ukraine, which is a high number of these, and they are counted obviously in this net migration. Also people from Hong Kong, that the number is smaller, but anyways it's still a substantial number. And also the increases in international student migration, and also workers coming in this healthcare visa. As some of you know, care workers were introduced in this visa last year. So now before they couldn't come on this type of visas, but now those who are on more senior roles, they can come to the UK, and many of them actually came, so that explains part of the increase. Obviously this huge increase in international students, right, that also you mentioned during the presentation. In terms of government policy, it's difficult. Obviously the government just has this general pledge to reduce migration. The irregular migration, it's one thing, right, that has been the most focused, especially during the last year, including irregular migration / asylum. In terms of the, let's say, regular migration, people coming to the UK on visas, it's difficult to reduce the number, especially right now in the short term, unless they do some kind of strict measures that they are discussing, like prohibiting graduate students, so people that come in here on masters to study masters or PhD, to bring dependents with them. So undergraduates, they cannot bring, in the current policy, they cannot bring any dependents, but if you come for a master's or a PhD, you can bring dependents. And in fact, yes, because the international students come from a more diverse pool of countries now, it's true that there has been an increase in the number of dependents, because maybe some mature students come. So obviously when people, when they are older, they tend to have a family, either a partner only or kids. So it makes sense that they come with them to the UK if they come for a 1 year or 2 year program. I'm not sure. I'm sure that this measure is going to meet with resistance from the universities, because obviously universities have a big interest in bringing international students because they represent a big part of their income. So other than those measures, I don't see any other measures that they can implement, because there's a great people are really in favor of allowing refugees or people from Ukraine and from Hong Kong to come. So I don't think that there will be a restriction on that. And the same with the healthcare visa. I don't think there will be restrictions on that either.
Yeah, it's gonna be difficult. So we are all waiting to see what they suggest or what they propose.
Mm.
Yeah, and I have another question that I mean, it's related to what you just kind of mentioned. Because there's been this substitution between international non-EU and EU students, right? So the number of EU students, as also Federico showed before, like decreased because of like increased tuition fees, and the number of non-EU students like skyrocketed, right? So actually there is much more. There are many more international non-EU students than EU. So, but in terms of the effect on the economy, so do you think that this is kind of a substitution 101 in the sense that, if you just look at the net number, maybe actually the number of students went up. So is it, should we be concerned or not, or should we have the preference for some types of student compared to others? So what is the effect? What do you think is going to be the effect of this substitution on the economy?
So first of all, students, international students always have a positive role, positive effect on the economy. In terms of there are two issues here. First of all, as you mentioned during the presentation, most international students don't stay in the UK, so their effect basically on the economy is during those 2-3 years that they stay. It's true that certain nationalities are more likely to stay after their studies and move on to work visas. For example, that's the case of the nationality that is more likely to stay after having a study visa are Indians, probably because they are in occupations for which there is a high demand, like IT occupations, for example. But most of the students, they tend to come back to their country. So it's a temporary increase in net migration, let's say, that even if they are coming now and we see this uptick, right, that probably will last for 2-3 years, but then most of these people will leave eventually. In terms of substitution, I would, in this case, I wouldn't look so much at the nationalities, but at the degrees that people study when they come here, the universities that they go to. If we assume that there are differences in levels of quality or across universities in the UK, which obviously this is a controversial issue, right? And but since there are so many universities, sometimes there has been discussion about that. But I would say it's mostly for those 20% or less than 20% who stay. Obviously, it depends on the degrees that they have, and they probably will continue in certain sectors of the economy, right? Not in others. But I will probably not pay so much attention to the nationality, but to the degrees and to where they go to study.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Emre wants to ask a question.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank to Federico for the presentation. It was really nice to listen to you. My question is that who is more likely to settle in the UK for longer? In other words, I can say who is more likely to be a long-term migrant in the UK? Thank you.
Is it for me or Federico? I can answer this.
For you.
Okay. Yeah. So usually migrants who are more likely to stay longer are people who come on family visas. And precisely people on family visas haven't increased in the last, it has remained constant basically during the last years. So these are actually the people, I think around 80% tend to stay in the UK. And that makes sense, right? Because the main reason why they are coming here is to join usually their partner. So it makes sense that they continue living in the UK. Whereas students, they tend to leave after 2-3 years, and workers also, to a greater extent, they tend to leave after a number of years in the UK. So a small number continue to live here.
Thank you.